Congress and the president interact through the lawmaking process, and they interact through the appointment process. The main way in which they interact in lawmaking is the president is given the ability to recommend to Congress measures from time to time, which has become the State of the Union address. And this is a way for the president to set the agenda and ask Congress to do certain things on behalf of the country. Obviously, the president can also veto legislation. And this, Hamilton said in Federalist 78, was to serve two functions. One was to allow for a check on the legislative power. So by vetoing bills, the president can prevent Congress from becoming too powerful. And the second was to make sure that the Congress passed good laws. So by either threatening a veto or by actually exercising a veto, the president is almost like the last line of defense against perhaps a bad law or an ill-considered piece of legislation. The second main point of interaction is through appointments. As a function of the president's executive power, the president is given the ability to appoint judges and to appoint heads of executive agencies, and the president does that with the advice and consent of the Senate.
Presidents love to think they have lots of influence on the legislative process, and in some cases they do. The president's role in the legislative process is generally greater when the party of the president also controls both chambers of the Congress, but certainly when the president's party is in control of the House of Representatives. As we've mentioned, the Senate is much more individualistic, so to some extent, which party controls the Senate is much less relevant. Presidents want to have more influence over the legislative process than they do, but where they can have influence is by setting kind of a national agenda. They have the power of the media, and they can command a press conference and a national audience. And so we know, for example, that when the president gives a State of the Union address, that often those policy proposals become pieces of the next Congress's legislative agenda. But presidents have no formal role in the legislative process until the very end, when they get to decide whether or not they want to sign or veto a piece of legislation. Presidents cannot introduce legislation. Beyond suggesting an idea, what they can do is simply use the media presence that they can command and use their surrogates at the executive branch agencies who come before Congress and advocate in order to encourage Congress to act. But up until that veto or signature point, the president does not have a formal role in the legislative process.
Again, here I think it's important to distinguish between, the few bills that everybody hears about and the 95% of the bills that nobody hears about. But the bills that fund the executive agencies, that provide for what all the executive agencies do, et cetera. For those executive agencies, so let's say, the bill that authorizes what the Pentagon does or authorizes what the Interior Department does, that is legislation that is framed, say, a reauthorization of the Interior Department. That really is legislation that's framed by the committee interacting actually with the executive agency. And that executive agency, of course, the top leadership is leadership appointed by the president. Okay. And in that sense, there's kind of a cozy little community of like-minded members, like-minded representatives, like-minded interest groups. And sometimes this has been called the world of the Iron Triangle, other metaphors as well. Basically like-minded people legislating in an area in which there's broad consensus, at least among those people. Important legislation, let's say, changes to healthcare or changes to important economic policy or what have you. It's going to be driven by usually driven by the president's agenda, articulated in the State of the Union, usually. The president usually has such strong ideas about what the legislation should be that the executive office of the president or the lead executive agency will actually deliver to Capitol Hill model legislation. And sometimes that model legislation will be adopted wholesale or just changed a little bit and thrown into the hopper by the chair of the relevant committee. So in that case, the president is really taking the lead, and a lot of the important, when we think about the important policy innovations in our lifetime or even before, whether it be the great, the New Deal in the 30s, or the Great Society, New Frontier of the 60s, or even the legislative initiatives, the Reagan administration. You pick your era. Reform to welfare during the Clinton administration. In fact, the way that I'm talking about this, we're talking about Congress passing laws, and yet we think about legislative eras being as parts of presidential administrations. And that tells us something about where the agenda comes from, and oftentimes where the language even comes from. And that's for two reasons. One is that, there's a couple million members of the executive branch. There's a great deal of capacity in the executive branch, and so it's natural to imagine that most of the ideas and most of the work on the front end is going to be done in the executive branch. That's one thing. The other thing, too, is, there's a veto, and in most circumstances, there are exceptions, but in most circumstances, it's not a good use of Congress's time to pursue policy paths that the president ultimately is going to veto. Now, again, there are important exceptions to that, but understanding that at the end of the day, the president is going to have to sign this or might send it back to a veto. It also gives special deference to the president in framing what legislation is likely to be like.
Well, the extent to which Congress is attentive to the president, again, depends on the party of the president, the party in control of the House and in the Senate. Typically, when you have unified government, the relationships tend to be stronger. So where you have the president and congressional leaders from the same party, the relationships between the White House and the Congress are much stronger. Interestingly, though, the literature shows that the success rate of the president is not necessarily greater when there's unified government than when there's divided government. There are lots of reasons that might be the case. But in general, the working relationship is much more positive when there's unified government than when there's divided government. In general, though, the president is a very powerful force. And whether you are from the president's party or you're not, if the president calls you, even out of respect for the office, it is very difficult for a member of Congress to just say, no, I won't do what you're asking me to do. And some members of Congress have even found that making a promise to the president ends up resulting in their losing the next election. So in 1994, when President Clinton was promoting health care, and he really called and leaned pretty heavily on a number of congressional Democrats to help him pass this legislation, and they agreed and they cast those votes, and then they lost their seats because their constituents didn't agree with it. So the president's a very powerful force, but ultimately, members of Congress are weighing their own electoral fortunes, their own policy priorities, and frankly, partisan considerations when they think about how to respond to a presidential request.